On this week's NFV SDN Reality Check, we speak with AT&T to get an update on its NFV and SDN deployment plans.
Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board, telecomcareers.com.
Hello and welcome to this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. Thanks for joining us this week. Well, AT&T has been at the forefront of telecom operators in their moves toward virtualized platforms. The carrier announced late last year plans to have up to 75% of its network controlled by SDN and NFV by 2020, which is a pretty aggressive move for a large telecom operator. Since then, the operator has provided a lot of insight and updates on its moves towards virtualized platforms, including earlier this year announcing that it had up to 5% of its network already controlled with a virtualized platform. We recently spoke with Margaret Chiosi, who's the lead network architect for AT&T at the CTIA Supermobility event in Las Vegas, to get some more insight into what the carrier has been doing in terms of those deployment plans, as well as some insight into some challenges and partnerships she sees the company in need of in terms of its continued move towards virtualization. Let's take a look at that video interview now.
Again, I know I'm kind of keeping up to date with you guys on the virtualization moves and stuff. I mean, you guys obviously have been pretty aggressive. I know you announced last year, the plans for having 75% of the network virtualized. I guess how's the progress going along with that? I know you guys have kind of
so the goal is 75% of our network to be more of an SDN virtualization cloud, right? By 2020. And so our target was 5% this year, and we're on track for that.
Yep.
So things are going well on the initial 5%.
Have you guys found any sort of challenges? I mean, obviously it's kind of early in the process. I know.
Oh, well, of course, there's lots of challenges. If it was easy, we would be done, right?
Yeah. I guess maybe any specific ones that maybe even you guys are perhaps...
Well, so I've been telling people we have probably about 4 challenges, maybe 3, depending on how you group it. So the first challenge is as you go from a vendor-specific, ASIC-specific appliance to now a COTS environment to get the throughput performance that you want. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is once you virtualize, things can move around. You can grow, you can shrink, and so forth. So you want full automation. So buried under their full automation, there's a lot there. The industry does not have a common framework for full automation. So if I go to vendor A for full automation platform, it's their version of an implementation. And if I want to go to vendor B, I have to move the whole enchilada. It can't mix and match. So that's one of the other challenges, to come up with a framework, a common framework of all the components that will allow us to fully automate and to be able to mix and match different vendors or different open source pieces of that. So that's the second challenge, I guess. And then the third is where you end up having a virtual application get re-optimized or be optimized on a virtualized platform. A lot of the vendors today are taking, if they existed before, they have their physical function and they migrated to a COTS environment, but they basically did not re-architect their app. They, of course, changed the drivers because now they went from their drivers to maybe a COTS driver, and then try to tweak with all these different, DBDKs and so forth of the world, SROV, for performance, but they haven't changed the whole structure of the app. And part of the throughput problems might be the app has to get redesigned. For example, they might end up going through user space, kernel space, back and forth. If you look at life of a data packet, and they might not need to do that. And so if you're going from user space to kernel space back and forth, your throughput might drop to 1/10, if even worse. And maybe if you optimize it so you stay in user space, you only go into kernel space once, maybe you get to maybe 80%. And your requirements aren't as high as before. So that, I would say, is probably the third area. Well, I put down full automation, and then I bury in the framework, a common framework as part of that full automation.
That's got to be a huge challenge, because again, it does seem like everybody I've been talking on topics as well, it's like there's still so much fluidity in what the standards are going to be, people working together, and that you guys are trying to actually make stuff work in an environment. I mean, that's got to be just frustrating, or is it challenging, or I mean
Well, my background is I came from Bell Labs, so it's always challenging. Frustration. My personality's always been that I never like things that were all laid out. To me, they're very boring because then you optimize. I always like the new where nothing's structured, and then it's like, oh wow, how do we get this thing to work and get structured? Yes, it's a big challenge. So AT&T, when we went down this path, we realized to truly meet our aspirational goals, we would have to develop this ourselves. We would have to design it ourselves. We have to develop it ourselves because the industry wasn't there yet, and it's still not there yet. We don't have the standard framework. We don't have the standard, and we don't have all the open source pieces. People are all over the place on how they want to do this, how they want to design it, and we had to get going. We have a target for 2020, and we could not wait. The good thing about us doing it ourselves, it helps us understand what the framework should look like, how it should work. And so in some sense, we're taking what's happening internally, and in fact, I'm taking what's happening internally. Once we recognize what the common framework should be for certain pieces, then I go out in the industry and basically give them my view of what we think it should be. And since we're so far ahead of a lot of the other carriers in the space, people are starting to listen because they're not as far along, to be fair. And you know, I don't get really prescriptive about it. It's very high-level functional blocks of what we're trying to do to just get people to think about it a certain way. And a few of the things that I've proposed, people have come up and said, wow, this really helps because it's just all over the place. And I say, yeah, I know that. But I'm waiting for anyone to counter us to say, no, this is a better framework. I mean, we're willing to look at better frameworks, but people are not as far along as us.
Sure.
And it's a challenge. I mean, that's the reason why we created OPNFV. This is the open platform for NFV. And in fact, I'm president of it. But we created it because you have all these different building blocks, some open, some proprietary, and there was no one place to try to really pull this together and try to get it to work. I mean, you look, there is no one organization. You have an OpenStack world that's focused on their piece. You have the Open Daylight world focused on the piece. ONS focused on their cloud, Foundry. I mean, it's just everyone all over the place. No one's pulling it together. And we as end users needed to be pulled together because it has to work. We can't just use OpenStack and nothing else. We need all these pieces to work together. And so that's our value proposition.
Yeah, I was asking, also as organizations, with OpenNFV is a prime example of that, it does seem like there are so many organizations out there that are popping up. It seemed like for a while there was a new one every week, doing something different, a smaller slice of the pie, basically.
Yes.
But like you said, it did seem like it was kind of a frustrating situation because, again, you were doing certain things, but now it's looking at the big picture. Is that kind of the key right now, is to be able to obviously work on small slices, but also make sure that... just like when you roll out anything, let's say, AT&T is going to develop, well, we are developing everything ourselves. You always have people in core competencies, right? You can't have everyone looking at the big picture. So you always have the SMEs that are involved in certain pieces. Well, that's the same thing happening in the industry. So you have IOvisor that's focused on data plane acceleration. You have DBDK focused on the, I would say, PCI type of data plane acceleration. You have the ODP focused on the SOC data plane acceleration. You have OVS, Open vSphere. I mean, everyone has their core competency, and so the industry should have that. The problem is for people like us, we need it all to work together, and so no one's focused on that. And we actually, as carriers and as end users, even the enterprise companies, I mean, we have a vested interest on getting it all to work. And vendors are, because it's not open, then they put their spin on it. It's all proprietary. And so if you really want to be able to move from one vendor to another, I mean, it's not there yet. And so that's the danger of, focusing on one vendor and using a vendor implementation. That's why AT&T is trying to build it ourselves. But we recognize our fellow carriers, they might not have the depth that we have on the developers, so they sort of have no choice, which is fine. But in the meantime, we have carriers very active, or users very active in OPNFV, because the goal is to eventually get to some open framework so that we can actually have more choice in how we customize our platform that we create for ourselves. Yeah, but it's going to be great, though, to, again, like you're saying, kind of be part of the initial run of this, because we do have that kind of influence over how it's all going to be, how it's all going to look going forward. Now, so you guys, Telephonic is pretty aggressive, even Docomo, and there's 3 or 4 carriers that whenever I talk to vendors, they always bring you guys up as, they're really driving this. This is kind of
well, if you look at the folks who originally started the ETSI ISG NFV, so AT&T was there, Verizon was there. Who is it? It was AT&T, Verizon, BT, Telefonica, Orange, DT. And then Docomo came, quickly. Well, and then a whole slew of people came quickly, Vodafone, Docomo, and so forth. And then everyone went to their own pace of going down this track. So I know Docomo is is quickly pivoting to this because they have the Japanese mandate because of the tsunami that actually forced them to go very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So.
Does it seem like the collaborative efforts between the operators is still a very, I guess, collaborative effort?
Oh, definitely.
Because it seems like,
Definitely.
Also the marketing side is always rivalries, but it seems like at least behind
Oh
the
yeah,
scenes, you guys
because a lot of the folks involved in the open source and a lot of people involved in the standards arena, a lot of them are either standards people or research people. And well, I mean, on the carriers or the end user side. So, in fact, the ETSI ISG NFV was so successful in that collaboration that, I don't know, we just know each other so well that it's very comfortable. In fact, you see people moving around to different companies. Some have even moved to vendors. Some of the vendors moved to carriers. And so it's the same folks that show up to these meetings, and so it's just they've got different hats, and it's the same group that's still working it, just a different angle. So.
Business card every once in a while.
Yeah.
But again, it does seem like I see from the vendor side though also a good collaborative effort because it still seems like I was talking to Nokia last week and they have their own way they're trying to do things.
The vendors, what I'm noticing, and this happened even in the standards world, the vendors are competitive with each other, and there's some groups that trust each other and some groups that don't for whatever reason. And there's just different people trust each other and different people don't. So there's a history. And I find as end users, we are needed, good and bad, to help make sure that the true spirit of what we're trying to do gets solved. So for example, just last week, we had a DBDK and an ODP little meeting. It was supposed to be originally 3 of us, turned into 10 of us. And I ended up inviting Cisco as a user of writing VNFs. I was like, when like 7 of these DBDK, ODP people were going to show up, and it was just me. And I don't write any VNFs, right? We buy VNFs. I realized they needed a real VNF vendor to help really drive them. So I actually approached Cisco, and they brought in excellent people who knew DBDK and ODP well. And we had an excellent, excellent meeting. In fact, we're going to have follow-ups. So, and we were trying to get DBDK and ODP folks to work with each other for the last 2 years. And they just were having issues. So finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I said, okay, we're all going to show up, and I'm going to be there. The joke is I'm becoming the mother of the industry. Because mother, or what was the term that David Ward said? He's called, David Ward called me the, what do you call it, the social engineer, the open source social engineer. And I said, that sounds very sexist. He goes, well, no, it's not. It's a compliment because it's like bringing all these factions that aren't getting along for whatever reason and putting in the business of why we're here. And it's very high level because I've done so many technical things. I've seen the technical fights. And in the end, it turns out it doesn't matter half the time. It's just pick a path and fix it and just as an industry, go down it and just fix it as you go along. I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. There's obviously certain things, but there's certain things that after a while, it's like, give it up, just pick a path and let's get on with life. And so I just basically go through my simple principles and I just keep reinforcing it as they get off track. I say, wait a minute, just let's go back. This is what's needed. Are you helping the cause or not? And if no, then I say, give it up. I won't say it here, but I basically gave a very specific business reality on how this whole DBDK ODP thing should get approached, even though one faction might not have been thrilled. But then Cisco, without me even talking to them ahead of time, emphasized the exact same thing. So it sort of laid the foundation of really how we should operate as we go forward. But we'll see. We just started. We had, 1-day meeting. Everyone felt good. We'll see as we get to the next one if it falls apart. And I'm getting pulled into more of these. We are so far removed as a user, but I am getting pulled into asking to show up on these pieces that really we're not developing this stuff. We're users.
Guys as being kind of the, their end customer at the end of the day, and you want to make sure your guys are happy and that things are moving
Yeah, and there's so many mistrust on some of these things that it's really sort of interesting. So that's the real value of the end user, to help really reinforce on what the value is to us, why certain things are important, and even how we want to migrate from one thing to another, because and it helps influence maybe on how they approach things, which they might not realize, because they're so down in the weeds, they really don't understand how we're really operationalizing anything, right? And so we give them the practical reality of life, and then they go, oh. I said, so, and I'm very simple, you either solve it or not, otherwise this is life and good luck. So.
Very nice, very nice. Are you finding, you guys did a really big part of bringing a lot of new names and new companies into kind of the telecom space.
Oh, definitely.
The main program is a big part of, the names you guys might have definitely new.
Yeah, well, let me tell you how we started. So when I became an individual contributor 3 years ago, and I worked for a VP, John Menamana, and he owned all the networking for all of AT&T, the mobility network, the wireline network, the access network, and so forth. And I always got into new technology, so he pulled me aside. I've been a manager for a long time, and he wanted me to look at new technology. So I told him I wanted to work on SDN and virtualization because that was the new thing. And at the time, we were looking at he's like, that's like really drastic. But I just started evolving. Anyhow, when we created the ETSI ISG NFV, we created it just to try to get a sense of how real this is. And the first meeting that we had in Nice was where I met a lot of these startups, which actually some of them became part of Domain 2.0. And I was shocked at what was already out there. Because, of course, we're always talking to the incumbents who were like P&F vendors, right? I just started pulling them in. And then startups coming out of the woodwork started when they realized who in the ETSI ISG, the carriers would start, they saw our names, so of course then they would come after us. And anytime I would usually have one meeting with them, and when I realized the value, potential, I would pull them into Menamana's factory team, I call it, to really talk through the potential. And that started opening up our eyes into this. So, and then of course, Domain 2.0 happened, and then of course, there was this whole push of, trying to get certain vendors in that were not our normal vendors, and then I guess the rest is history. They sort of some of them ended up in our domain program. In fact, some of them were really shocked because they never saw AT&T move so fast. They go, Margaret, we just met with just you, and the next it's like 3 months later, and I started laughing. I said, hey, I didn't appreciate how much power I had. But but it wasn't power. It's just, it lined up. Everything, it was like that perfect storm. I was just fortunate enough that by doing that ETSI, the startups found my name. I would listen, and I would bring some of them in. I didn't bring everyone, but we brought some of them in. We started having discussions with the factory side of the house. And then people started getting, better ideas and so forth, and how to use, and then, the rest is history. So.
Yeah, I know going to team performance and all
the catalyst
programs. You guys always had new people in part of that. So yeah, it's very interesting to see that collaboration. And all the companies you were working with were very excited.
Yeah. Well, when we created the ETSI ISG NFV, the reason why we picked ETSI was they had this thing called an ISG, an independent study group, which is normally like 20 people. This is like hundreds now, right? But it allowed us to do whatever we wanted in organizing. You did not have to be a member of ETSI, which is expensive. Because if you're at the other organization models under ETSI, you have to be a member, and you have to vote, and the only ones who can vote are members, and you got to pay these thousands and thousands of dollars. And we wanted to create a forum where anyone could join, startups could join, because we realized they had no money. Startups could join, academia could join, anyone could join, and we wanted them to participate. We wanted them to have equal voice. So we decided we would do everything through consensus, because once you vote, you had to be a member. So, but at least the ISG gave us a forum we could do that. And it was sort of ugly at times on this consensus, because one person can hold up everything, and then you had to work it out. But it was very effective, and so it brought in the startups. They felt comfortable in being able to participate and be of equal voice and actually hear us. And then they had access to us, to the carriers and so forth. And so it was very, very useful. In fact, startups are constantly still, going through that.
Has it been a challenge to get those new guys on board with kind of the requirements of a telecom operator? Because obviously, AT&T, you have a long history, you guys are carrier grade, you guys have a certain level of quality to expect, and virtualization is kind of a different way to look at things.
Yeah.
Are you getting those guys maybe from the data center world?
Well, some of the startups came from some of these incumbents.
Okay.
Right, I mean, if you look at a firm, look at, Hassan, he was, I knew him when I owned ATM, Concept Through Delivery. I knew him when he was Cascade. He was a Cascade CTO. And then he went to Sonos, so we had a great relationship with him on Sonos. And then, he started, even though it was a firm virtualization, right, and so forth, and of course, he has Ron Park. There's all these folks that came from all his history. So some of them have, in fact, a few of them. And Viata probably is the one that we probably didn't know. They came from a different space.
Yeah.
Not from the whole carrier space, but some of these other, Connectum some of the folks came from the carrier space. So it's sort of sprinkled around.
Okay. It's not a huge challenge to get those people up to speed.
Well, I wouldn't say,
A little challenge.
yeah, it depends, depending on the person, depending on the company and so forth and sort of structure. But, it's been wonderful, I think, in some sense.
For me, I know I've been for a couple of years now, just watching the rapid growth and expansion, it's just been amazing. It's been a part of the industry that's just growing crazy.
Well, we only came up with this ETSI ISG 3 years ago. Yeah, 3 years
Here we are
ago.
now,
And who would have thought, 6 of us do, who would have, we just laughed. 6 of us. No funding needed, we just had to get travel approval, that was it. Because we're all members of ETSI, we just needed travel approval to do this thing. And the 6 of us started and look at this, we're like, oh my God. So it's quite
You
interesting.
can pretty support though from the top of AT&T. We got Randall Stevenson talking about the need for virtualization.
Yeah.
You got everybody talking
But when we
about it.
started this 6 years ago, 3 years ago, they didn't know any of this, right?
And now we're on board.
This was before we did Domain 2.0 didn't exist when I started this.
Yeah.
Well, I was put on the Domain 2.0 committee. So that's how this pivoted, because I was already into this space. And so I actually introduced the ideas, and then the whole team really rallied around it because it's so drastic.
Yeah.
And then the rest is history, I guess.
Well, I guess the timing, it does seem the timing is great because even here at the show, we get a lot of 5G talk. It seems like the timing of your deployment plans along with where 5G is going to be, or the deployment plans, and obviously people only talk about 5G. Virtualization is a huge part of it. You need that automation.
But if you look at the people who are very engaged in the ISG NFV, I would say, I'll make it up, like a half are from the mobility space. So they moved it up. The ideas are, just circulating. You had a core group that really rallied around it, and then it's like, this networking thing, like LinkedIn, right? You have a core group, but then, you get connected to all these other people, and then the word just spreads, or whatever, your network keeps spreading.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. You have this core group, and then because of all our linkages with all these other factions, if I call it that, it just starts spreading, and then you have another core group that gravitates toward it and just spreads like wildfire.
Yeah.
This shows how, as an industry, how very innovative you can be if you just let folks just network naturally and recognize the true value of things. It worked really well.
Yeah, it's going to be a big part again. Like I said, a big part. It seems like it was 5G movement.
Oh yeah. Well, GI Lancer is, if anything's, prime for service chaining and virtual. That's the most obvious one. And then it just evolves.
Well, obviously my camera skills need a bit of work, but I think we got some great insight there from Margaret on AT&T's plans as it moves towards virtualization, and some great insight also into what the company is looking for in terms of vendor support in its move towards virtualization. Well, again, thanks for joining us on this week's NFV SDN Reality Check, and make sure to check us out again next week. Thanks for watching.
NFV SDN Reality Check with Dan Meyer is a production of RCR TV. To suggest show topics or to reach Dan, you can find him on email, dmeyer@rcrwireless.com, and on Twitter @Meyer_Dan. For more Dan, news on NFV SDN and everything wireless, find your way over to rcrwireless.com.